Hi everyone. I just want to thank you both for your wonderful films, and I guess we'll start with a bit of a conversation. These things are always a bit odd for like for artists to start talking about the intricacies of their work because so much of that is sort of invisible, but in the making. But I would say, like, amidst the background of modernist facades, amidst the background of the material palette of modernism, which is concrete, um, emplaced in these sort of natural environments, amidst that kind of figural clarity within these natural environments, there's another set of figures for me that are just kind of vague but incredibly meaningful. And those two figures are desire and loss. So I was wondering if maybe either one or both of you could take turns maybe talking about or describing aspects of desire, longing, and or loss as this other vague figural element in the visual work you've both presented.
OK, thank you. Bonsoir, merci d'être venu à la présentation. OK, desire and loss. My idea with that film was to actually I attended several concerts at Offered Music, and I was impressed by the work that it involves to work with a piece created like 300 years ago or 200 years ago by very young people, and I was struck by the contrast with our time that is so fast, and the time they spend to learn that piece. So the desire would be there, I think, for them to decide to take so much time in their life to to achieve like a performance eventually with composers. So probably the desire would be there, and the loss. We didn't have the question before, so I have to think fast. The desire, the loss. No, the loss. It's probably well, maybe like you get maybe a sense of history. Of course, if you think about the composers, and so maybe we can question ourselves about qu'est-ce qui perdure dans le temps, what stays in time for years. So, and maybe there's a loss eventually. So maybe that's the way I could answer to that question.
Thank you.
For my film recitation, actually the idea of the film itself is very much was born out of the personal loss that I experienced of the South Korean neighborhood, or the generation of concrete panel buildings, large housing apartment complexes of like post-war era that went through urban redevelopment, and I basically that my neighborhoods that I grew up in sort of disappeared in the last 5 years, 5 years, and then the film was also born out of the desire to find a place in the other parts of the world where it has some kind of familiar history or features. Architectural design or urban planning. And the proposal of the film was to go there and experiment with the feeling of being in a completely foreign place where I've never been to, but then find a very similar neighborhood where I could recognize, or I have a feeling of recognition in those physical elements in the design. So yeah, that would be the loss and the desire that kind of coalesce in the motivation of the making. In the film, though, I think I was hoping to experiment with this method where I would guide the viewers or the audience through their own mental image by the narration that's going through the over the pictures. But then you have these two figures who walk through the those neighborhoods, follow each other. They look at each other, but then the camera also look at them. So there's some kind of intersections of gaze where you have some gaps of perceptions. So then, so that my idea was to experiment with that experience of like going through the gaps and also actually having this kind of mental map, some kind of a mental maze all throughout the film. So it's that would
Yeah,
be
no,
my.
I could definitely see and attest to that. Was there an aspect of your work then, because you're talking about this sort of psychogeography, building out a relationship to site and to place through the individual subjectivity, um, that becomes sort of a journey? And it reminds me a lot of sort of like the Situationist and the derive and so forth. Did that play into your framing or how you were thinking about developing this psychogeography?
Yes, I do. I am very interested in the Situationist International, also this idea of the reef, and also moving through the space with motivation that is not particularly aligned with like a conventional way of looking at things. So it's very much to go into your own memories or your own sensorial memories, basically, or feelings or psychological like space to look and actually see something else in a way, to discover something else that's underneath of it, which could also bring up this idea of loss, or something that you have lost stays with you unconsciously, and then you see something and then it reminds you of things like this. So yes, in that way, I guess I was experimenting with this idea of the reef, or the method of going through the psychogeographic landscape with the film. So like not in the physical way, but in the mental
Sure.
sort of pictures.
Yeah. I would say that both of your films, at least for me, had a sense of framing. The way you frame certain shots with regard to angles of buildings, curvatures, maybe against the mountain, for instance, that had a quite pleasing sort of defamiliarization, at least for me, about it. Um, the experience of seeing through that kind of framing um, was unique enough to feel sort of special. So when you were in your environments, maybe you can talk about the site specificity of being at the Orford Academy. Um, what does it feel like to be, in an environment like that with these almost sculptural modernist buildings, but being emplaced, surrounded by nature in that way? Maybe you can speak to the quality of that kind of feeling and experience.
Yeah, but for sure, the site interested me because of that, because it's modern buildings from the 60s, and there is like 3 main pavilions, and actually a fourth one where the practices are taking place. But one of the pavilion was from the Expo 67, and it was dismantled on Notre Dame Island or Ile Sainte-Hélène, I'm not sure. And then it was reassembled on that site that offered music for the academy that started in 51, I think. So of course those buildings are attractive, but I was interested between like the dynamic between the musicians and the buildings, and but I didn't know what to expect exactly. So as in all my work, I decide to work with a site, and then I go there and I explore, and then the project with the camera after that, the project is building up in a sense. And I realized that there was not so much interaction between the musicians and the buildings. and not so much interaction between the musicians themselves. So I decided to focus, but at first I wanted to focus on their practice, but I decided to frame with the cameraman. We decided to frame like in 2 shots, really like the close-ups and like a medium shot. And I imagine the image to, they're not square, but in my mind, it's like they are kind of square shape, like a Polaroid, but it's not there. It's not this, but it's something like very simple and very that I have in mind when I think about those 10 portraits.
For sure, I could definitely see the portraiture aspect, or aspiring to have a portrait in this way. So the square actually kind of makes sense because then it centralizes your focus on the object, so to speak. Um, I didn't know if you wanted to also respond to.
I almost forgot the question. So it was about the framing,
Yeah,
framing the
same here.
materiality of the building into
Maybe
an
just
image.
just about the framing. I guess another way we could put this too is like what do you feel silence silence means to you in terms of being in these spaces and thinking about how you're going to frame or visualize for the viewer. Does silence play into that, or is there? I mean, particularly with yours, there's an obviously there's an ambient there's a soundtrack that sort of guides us through, as well as the psychogeography. But in a way, both films have a feeling of like a meditative, almost quiet, monastic, in a way, kind of a silence. Is that something you think through, or is that a feeling that resonates with either of you?
That's very interesting that you see or feel silence in this film because there's so much music, and then there's a lot of ambient sound, and also there's voiceover. So you could feel, you're always guided to into something. That's very interesting. And the silence, in terms of perceiving the place through images. I think it's staying with, or this idea of just duration in front of something and then actually looking for a while to feel or to discover something that's sort of reflecting off to you. So it becomes I guess when you don't pay attention to anything, things become meaningless. But then if you look long enough, then it becomes meaningful at some point. So I think the aspect of duration is interesting, but then the duration in which you are also alone in your own mental space and in silent state of mind, I guess that would be my answer to your question.
Sure.
I could say the same thing. Like meditation is certainly a word that we can use somehow with that film, and it's also a privacy. Like the silence would be maybe the privacy of the musician. Yeah.
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 Yeah, no, I agree, which is why I brought up that the whole monastic kind of a situation. Maybe at this point we can begin to search for questions out in the audience that you may have for the artists, or is that, or we could certainly keep talking. I mean, I could go on. I mean, I have copious notes for both films. Um, for me, a lot of things were broken down into dualities, place and placelessness, for instance, in the feeling of belonging, right, which plays into this whole thing of loss as well. Um, I would say even for your previous projects with parks, for instance, there's an emptiness, but not like a hollow emptiness, but just almost like the silence of place, which is why I wanted to bring out these themes of maybe silence or meditation. Are there any other aspects of the built environment as against the natural environment that you think are resonant for your works, like that make it super meaningful for you to frame things in terms of like concrete and like a mountain, or maybe a lamppost surrounded by bushes, for instance?
Um, I think one of the motifs in the film that appears uh, quite a number of times during the sequence is this sphere-shaped lamp post. That's very common design for. You can find number of them here too. I think that I use that lamp, very like common lamp post, as some kind of marker that kind of these characters revolve around, and that becomes a concrete somehow pin, if you could say, in which you can. That's like a recognizable point in terms of the trajectories that they are
How you
making.
can orient yourself
Mhm.
in these environments. I see.
Because the film actually have 5 different locations that are all over like some kind outskirts of Berlin. They're sort of not close to each other. They're like very far away from each other, which I basically compressed it into this sequence of a 20-minute film. But then you would find this common shapes, and I use that to guide or to have this distance shortened or eliminated even between different neighborhoods. And they were all sort of built in different eras too. The first neighborhood that you see was built in the 1930s, and then the second one is Kropiestadt, which was built in the 70s. Margit Viertel, also 70s and 80s. And then when you go to Marzahn, it's actually built from 80s to all throughout the 90s. And then in the end, you get to a new construction site where you only see like the sticks of trees that are not mature. So also the scale of the nature or the domesticated nature, if I could say, the natures in the neighborhood, you would feel the time, because in Jimmestad, which was built in the 30s, the trees were just so divine. It was beautiful. So like those become the markers of time, but then it also becomes part of the resident's life. It becomes so much more livable now. For example, the Margit Viertel was with the very high-rise buildings with like massive concrete blocks. If you can imagine, there's no vegetation there. That's very bleak. But right now it's okay because there has time passed, and then the vegetation and the trees grew. So those are the transformations that I think these neighborhoods, especially when they are built, historically or collectively, the memories are fixed with the problematics that it had when it started its experimentation. And then the discourse of it somehow kind of stayed there. But then when we look at it now, it can be a different place for with the time. So.
I'm not sure I have much to say about that. Um,
Maybe I can ask a slightly different question.
mhm.
Are there aspects about urban spaces or about natural spaces that draw your attention, that this is the kind of subject that I want to create a portrait out of, or a series of portraits?
Mm. Well, I'm not sure if that answers your questions, but I realized at first I thought that I would take shots of nature more, and then I thought that maybe it wasn't a good idea to associate classical music with with nature. It's like too, you know. So I wanted to show nature, but like close to the building or in a not constructed way, mais comme entretenu, la nature entretenue. So the mountain, the mont offered, you have the slopes, so it's constructed nature, something, or the nature that is around. But this is like one part of the film, but the main part is it's like a huis clos. Like the musicians are in a box most of the time. Yeah, and this building reminds me a lot like the Bauhaus aesthetic, like the building where they practice. Maybe that's
I
what I
saw
could say.
affinities there with that, as well as the Gropius house you see
Ouais.
in your film. So this is from the same sort of modernist canon of cellular-like rooms, flat facades, concrete geometric forms, and so forth.
And because the building are a bit old, they need some maintenance. So it's hard to tell where it is exactly. It could be in Europe, maybe. It could be, it's, and I like that kind of a feeling, that not knowing exactly where it is.
Exactly. Yeah. Very good.
I was wondering if some people have question about the process. Maybe it's important when we make art. So.
Yeah, I mean, if does anyone have any questions?
Hello. Hi. Thank you for thanks both of you for showing the film. They are quite beautiful. I feel something like in both of your works there's a kind of either connection or spirit we can see between you and the main characters or the young people who participate in the work. I'm actually quite curious about the process of making when you communicate with them, because somehow I feel their presence activate the space and their voice or either their actions change the dynamic of the space. And I'm curious about the either expectation, interaction you had with them before or during the production, and then also how they see you, both, because both of you are more senior, mature, and then maybe almost somehow kind of role model to them. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I feel I'm very curious about this kind of exchange dynamic, that how you expect them and how they actually see you or how they respond to you. Yeah.
Okay, for me. Okay. The way I worked for that project, the residents are there for 1 week or 2 or 3. So I was asking for the schedule of all the musicians. And then I was doing some research on the internet to see who's who and who's playing what instrument. And then I would send emails to some musicians and ask them if they would be interested to be filmed while they are practicing. And I was really tell them that I'm not interested in the performance. It's really the practice that I want to film. And some of them didn't answer back. So, and some of them did. So I tried to see them before, but I didn't know what they would play, and I had no expectation. It was really like an improvisation on site. So I was, so when I was contacting the musician, I was meeting the musician on the side. And then, okay, maybe because they are very busy, so maybe in 30 minutes, you can come with your instrument, and we would film like for 30 minutes to an hour, each musicians. But actually, I didn't know what they would play. It was just important that they understood that it was the practice that I wanted to film. And I was really impressed by the way they could be with themselves, even if we were 3. Like myself, the soundman, and the cameraman, and they were able to concentrate on their practice. So that's the way we worked. So it was a lot of improvisation. I had like 6 days for shooting, so I was adapting to their schedule and who wants to play, and working like that with this way.
For me, I met them in Berlin. I was when I started to produce film there, and they're both from not Berlin. They're from Echo is from Chengdu, China, and Haeyun is from Seoul, South Korea. So they were both studying / working there. They're kind of there temporarily or not temporarily. It's like kind of undecided situation. So when I talked about the idea of the film, we sort of shared the experience of living somewhere else that's outside of their home, and also this idea of a home. So we sort of easily connected through that avenue of talking about practical difficulties that you face. How do you get your groceries here? Like, this kind of cultural sort of commonality become a very fast connection. So so in that way, I guess it was not so difficult to connect with them. But then, and working with them was very, 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 very nice. They're both non-actors as well. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Chichen? I think it was, yeah, it's interesting. Expect anything? Their expectation. Like, in terms of, like, I guess, I can't, I did not ask what they have expected out of this experience, but both of them wanted to participate because they thought it would be a great experience for them. Like, they wanted to experience the film set in a way, to participate in an art project, and they're both not from arts background as well. So this way of engaging to a personal sort of artist project was a new experience for them. So in that way, they were expecting a good time, maybe something to learn or something to expand their knowledge or experiences. So that would be my answer.
Yes, I can add that I realized that professional, like those musicians, they want to make a career in music. So they are more and more aware of the media, and they want to be filmed, I think, or they have to be used to it. I don't know, I think they realized that probably that it won't be like a promotional video that I would do with them, but I think that they like to be in front of the camera because they will have to do it in their career. So that's maybe they were expecting an experience, another experience with the camera.
Interested how you both of you engage with the camera and the body. In your work, Myriam, we could say that the camera is more still. It isn't completely, but you're engaging with a body that is almost static, not quite, but it activates itself in relation to what it needs to do to activate the instrument. and it's extremely internalized, right? So one has the feeling that the camera is working in a way that's internalized, right? Whereas with Jin's work, the camera seems to be moving all the time. It engages with those two figures who engage with the camera, and those figures are always on the move. I wouldn't say they're wandering, but they're moving towards something that we don't quite know what it is and that they'd never reach, right? So the camera is a seeking camera, whereas the camera kind of burrows in your case, Myriam. And I'm wondering whether you could address that, body camera, how it engages with the body, or engages with you in this.
Oh, okay. Okay, I can answer first. I've sort of thought about the role of camera in this film as something that can be quite ambiguous. It could have its autonomy almost. It has its own way of looking, but then it can be very sort of utilitarian, like you're following something and the camera goes for it. But then there are moments where the camera is just looking alone to the things that it sees. And I think in that way, I was sort of, I wanted to create this experience of like embodied camera, but then the externalized camera at the same time. Like with the voice of the narration, like the voiceover narration, you are taken into the position of the camera to look at something, but then you're also taken out when you are following or looking through a character's gaze. So yeah, in a way, I sort of thought of, because the camera is moving almost when it's moving quite often, and like it moves as if you are sort of walking. So there's this tracking shots where the camera is kind of walking. So I sort of thought of the camera as a separate body almost in this film. Another body that is present, but then not corporeally present. It's like just, it could be an idea that's present, or invisible object is the camera. So yeah, that was my sort of imagination in the process.
We had 2 cameras every time, and I guess maybe it was. I thought I wasn't behind the camera. I was looking at the scene, and I was talking with the cameraman to. He suggested me some shots, and I suggested him other shots. I didn't want to be invasive, and I thought that that could be an issue because we were in small rooms, and you have the musician, the instruments, the wires, the microphones, the soundman, cameraman, and I was afraid at first that the camera would be invasive for the musicians, but so that's the distance, like that we had to. I don't know, like the limit where you have to work maybe, but it worked. I think the musicians, they felt comfortable after all. And it's true that it's static, but I was really impressed. I don't know much about music, and I was really impressed by those musicians. So I was there like in a certain distance of also a kind of a respect, or also impressed, but also we have to film them. So it's like a play of being not too close, but sometimes, but within a small room. That would be my answer for that.
Hello. Hi. Great work. I think that part of what we're reflecting on, perhaps, is also the curation, putting these two films together. There's something very interesting about how they work in the sort of architectural and also in terms of nature too as well. There's something very pragmatic too as well that I think gets sort of the magic gets a little bit distorted. The magic I'm talking about is how it is that the imagination of being in a different place, and that it sort of gets a little bit distorted, as it does with the musicians and the way that they're captured when we start talking about some of the actual tools that we use to try and capture these things, so that we as audience members and or the jury members who are selecting these things can see the works. And I think what I'm getting at is that what you were able to achieve was something very real and very immediate. Probably a little bit more so in Myriam's work, only in the fact that it was less scripted and more just about the actions that were taking place, and the reflection of the practice and practicing to the actual concrete reality of the buildings. And then there's the landscape that was sort of haunting and a memory of something that also is in the process of trying to develop. And I'm thinking of the mountain, for example, and how it actually is something else, but we only see it in its dormant state, meaning it's not a ski hill anymore. The other works, and I don't really know if I even have any questions, but some of the questions that are coming up are quite interesting in terms of how it is that we reflect on this idea of place, an idea of place in both, but particularly with the shots in the various cities, and the narration that drew us through and made me think about a name for that tree when it came up, and how it's irrelevant, but to really the overall scheme of things, but it becomes very personal. And it's a marker, it's a place, and it's a way to establish some kind of meaning to this drifting through and finding our place in the unknown, I guess. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to be able to express some of the things and the congratulations that I have for making these films, but also for the way that they were put together. And by that, I mean the process that was done, but also in the curation for tonight too. I think it's quite meaningful, because other films would have had different kinds of outputs and ways that we feel about things. So it's a way to say thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, for the curation, we are the two recipients of this production grant, and these are, I guess, not the premeditated curation. It's a coincidence, actually, that it happened that we had so much in themes and subject matters that sort of intersect, and we only found that out maybe last month about how much commonalities that we have between the two films. Yes, thank you so much for the comment.
Never mind. I thought I saw a potential hand.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I kind of wanted to continue on the collaboration aspect of the project, and especially the fact that, as mentioned earlier, the usage of youth and new generation in the work. I was wondering, how do you like situate these generation in face of like how, like in Jin's work, that homes are being destroyed right now, and there's always this idea of pursuing new modernist building, and because of that we are destroying a home, while on the other hand, like classical music can be very linear as well, where this new generation bring new voices in this kind of music world. So I was just wondering how do you place youth in both of these worlds, and how can maybe reenact change or reimagine new future in a way?
That's a very interesting question. I think I well, I can't say I understand 100% what the new or the younger generation goes through, or has this different idea of home or different phases of loss in, kind of in different weight. But I thought that expressing this sense of loss was a very important step in order to move towards something that is a potential for a new idea of home or new ways of creating attachments or building sense of belonging. So I wanted to address that this feeling actually exists. This sense of loss is very much with us. And globally, I mean, I lost the place, and losing a place can be very heavy in terms of how you can process that. It takes years, or it could maybe perhaps never get resolved. If I can speak to a diasporic context, and then I was reading about this idea of melancholia, mourning and melancholia of Freudian ideas. It basically addresses a loss in a way that continues without a subject. There's no fixed point where you can attach your loss to, so that you cannot really resolve it. So then it just goes on. And then so the idea was that the loss of a place can feel like that, maybe, because it is unresolvable. And I think, I don't have a statistic, but I think just observing general tendencies in global scale is that we lose home, or the legacies of maybe 50 years ago, and most of the young generation has grew up in those neighborhoods, and they end up going just a very newly developed, and it becomes a completely new place, including the demographics. It just changes the fabric of the whole community and disrupts the ecology that's already built there. So that's a very profound loss, I think, and I think it needs to be addressed in this sort of emotional or psychological way before it can actually go to somewhere that's more concrete and action based. I don't know. I guess I wanted to recognize that in a way.
Could you repeat your question?
I guess for your case, I was talking about how new generation of youth right now, artists or not, are faced with a situation where to attain modernity, we destroy or we stick to linear trajectory. In Jin's case, we're talking about how home are being destroyed for these new buildings. And maybe for your case, we see this new generation of musicians playing interpretation of classical music that have been played for 200 years. So is there a way for new generation to enact changes, or is it faced with something way bigger than them? As in your video, I find it interesting where how they play are not perfect. They make mistakes, and I'm just wondering how these new generation can make change in faced with something so either destructive or very linear. I don't know if I made it more vague. But
No, I understand your question, but I don't know what to say, really. I'm not sure. It's true. It's linear, probably in, I don't know, maybe we can ask how long young musicians will take on old pieces, but it has been like this for many, many years. So will it continue, or somehow someday it will stop, or it depends on the way it is archived, I guess, and played over and over. So it's like a flux maybe, but I don't know. I will stop here, I think. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one thing I found very interesting, particularly in your film, Jin, was this was not only this kind of ambling, this walk vaguing of loss that is just in the air, but also the indifference of the built environment. When you look at these modernist facades, the coldness of them, and the extent to which the style itself exported itself all throughout the world, and displaced meaningful signifiers of home, particularly in the built environment. It's just this interesting counterweight that I see in the film, you know, just desire and longing played against loss, but also against this kind of cold indifference of facades. I don't know if that's something you wanted to speak to, or
The cold indifference. So this is, I think, the difference in which I regard those neighborhoods or the buildings. I don't see them cold and indifferent. I actually identify with them with my own memories. So that's very subjective. I understand, a very personal way of perceiving a place. So I was hoping that this film can overcome and sort of create this another rendering of those film or of those places as non-generic or yeah, or somehow a meaningful place. I did use them in the film as some kind of a background or the backdrop because of the lack of connection that the subject actually has in terms of socially speaking, because they don't have lived experience in those places. So they become a stage, but then it's a recognizable place in a way, recognizable. So those modernist buildings, because they are so generic, and you can actually find them here too if you if I looked hard enough, I could find it, you know, in China, in Japan, in Africa, in in African countries, and like in European countries, anywhere you would be able, it's not difficult to find them. So then I think because of those common or generic facade or the design of those and distribution also of those buildings, they become meaningful place because so many people, like, I mean, I shouldn't say so many people, but it could be a pointer for a person who's from abroad to rely on them as a point of familiarity. If I can speak to a diasporic context, to be someone who's from outside, to be looking at the not so foreign buildings, I think that's a very important sensation to keep and to appreciate, to ground someone into a place. So yeah, so I guess that's another sort of way of interpreting the place.
Hi, Myriam, I just thought about something in relation to that question. I was asked about change and youth and so on, because in your, it's about classical music and the protocols around it. And in fact, what we see here are, they're youth, right? They're young, but they're not dressed as classical music requires when it's performed publicly, right? And I've always been disturbed by that, how that kind of practically doesn't evolve, right? I mean, when our classical concerts, there's this kind of code for dress that makes it that in a certain way, the music has to exist in a disembodied way. It's like negating the work of the body. And you have all the musicians dressed in such a way so that they're there, but they're also almost invisible. Whereas when you see them like that, dressed in jeans or dress, and I found that really interesting to see what they were wearing. Not that that's unusual, and we know that all kinds of musicians, when they're rehearsing and so on, just dress in any old way. But when the minute it goes public, there's a code of dress there that's so rigid, right? And I don't know what it says about change, right? I mean, in relation to classical music, even if there's an interpretation, a new interpreter that, chamboule tout, there's still, when they do recordings, present themselves within those protocols, right, of dress. And that kind of represses the change, right? And I just found that interesting because that, is in that piece there, that film, they're just, I think how they're dressed is also very present in the film, not just how they play, right, the instruments. So that's just a comment. I don't know if you want to say.
I would also agree too. I mean, just you're capturing like an organic session, an organic part of. You capture so well just the organic part of the creative process, not the end result, but like what one goes through to produce something, which is in itself another comment on sort of temporality and whatnot. But I thought that was a very important part of your work in a sense. It's about process. I don't know if you wanted to add anything. I guess, are there any other thoughts, questions?
Thank you. So congratulations for your films. I was wondering if you could talk about the sense of weight of time in your film, or the vulnerability of memory. It seems like in both of the films, that sense of belonging, whether it's within the language of music, or the passage of music through time, or the belonging of environment and space, and how memory is affecting our sense, if that makes sense, like your relationship to memory within the work. Because I feel like the work is really about spaces, but for me, it's also a lot about memory, whether it's by learning to practice a song over and over, or by finding yourself in new space. So yeah.
You're right. I don't have a comment on that, but it's true. It's something about memory, what we keep, what we will not keep. Yeah.
The vulnerability of memory, and before that, what did you say? Weight of time. I think it's a very difficult question. I think, yeah. I think time, when it's related to loss, maybe becomes more durational. It becomes suspended somehow, because maybe you're stuck in that space. So the weight of time change, I think, in terms of how you perceive the duration. I don't know if that makes sense. But then the vulnerability of memory, for me, if I can say something about that, is probably, I would say, the memories are attached to physical things and physical places. For me, it's really important that it's attached to something visible. But then if those visible markers are not available anymore, it goes into the void. And I think when we encounter something that's familiar, it kind of brings out and I was sort of not, in a way, I guess, being aware of how vulnerable it is in a way to the loss when once some kind of index gets removed. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Kind of.
When you're talking about the sense of loss, do you think that are you fearing of forgetting or being forgotten in these spaces?
Oh, both, I think. Maybe it's both. Because yeah. Forgetting and yeah, because I think one of the things that that I was talking to when I was talking to my friends and also myself when we went through this, my South Korean neighborhood going to demolition, it really felt like we are being erased. Like our part of our life was being erased. Like in that way, it was very personal. Like I was being forgotten. That part of my life is being forgotten, and in that way, I was afraid of being forgotten, and also with the time, I know that I will forget without the visible markers, right? So I think I'm afraid of both. But to be able to create something that can somehow delay this process, I think that's why I'm invested in it, like to work on this film and other projects. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to kind of build on that, but in a maybe pivot in some way, and that with both of the films, I've had a real sense of joy and discovery and dedication and creativity that the characters in your film and even the narrative was telling, bringing me on a journey of discovery, of a recognition of those things that are visible but that we don't see in our regular space. And in Myriam, in your film, the students, or well, they're not students, they're musicians, but they are young, so they're still at that early stage of their career, and they're, that they were willing to share their mistakes is one thing, but it wasn't that they were sharing their mistakes. They were engaged with their mistakes. They wanted to fix those, and they played with them, and they were creative in the ways in which they were trying to approach that problematic that they were facing in the practicing, and then doing it in this setting that gave them another breath to see. And so I just wanted to say that, well, I can also see the loss or the desire. There was also a lot of joy, creativity, a expression of interest and engagement that change is always upon us. And so the way how we respond to that is the ways how we can create the memories or the experiences that carry us forward, because things are always changing, right? And even though it was a classical music, it's still brand new for the person who's learning it. Everything's new and trying to work it through. So I just wanted to say that it was very positive too. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I will add a bit more to your comment. I think the positive, the motivation itself for me to make this film was very positive. I want to create memories in this new place that I don't know, and then if I will see if I can do it by going there and then like creating these moments. So yes, there is the joy of discovering or experimenting with this situation.
Thank you, Laurie, for your comment. I'm happy that you talk about joy because I felt that also when I see, especially the last violinist. It touches me a lot to see him playing, and it's like I'm touched by seeing their efforts, because I don't know, it's okay. It's like a lot of things are achieved and we see them through media, and we never see like the effort and what it takes to build that. And yeah, so I'm very touched by they agreed to introduce us in their private sphere, and yeah, and they're in their hard work, but it's true that there is joy. And I think it's stressful what they do, and it's stressful to have a career in classical music, but I think there is a lot of joy too, and I could feel it through them. Mm.
I'm like so shy to ask a question, but I'm trying. Jin, I have a question to you. I was wondering, when you had an idea for this film, did you write the voiceover before going to this place, or is the voiceover like kind of like your wish for what you will find there, or did you write it when you were there and it is the response to what you felt in this place?
I wrote it in Berlin after I did all the location hunting. So I was very busy in Berlin, basically. So I wrote it while I was there. But I had a working idea in my mind about using this method called method of Loki. I don't know if anyone knows. It's called memory palace, and it's a technique that people use. Memory. What do you call it? Anyway, there's a competition for who can remember many things at the same time. And this is one of the techniques that people train in order to store a lot of information. So it's basically a technique where you build up a mental space, mental architecture in your mind, and then you store the items that you would like to remember in different places. So you would also draw a trajectory in your mind in order to find those informations that you would like to remember. So it's this kind of a spatial way of storing the information in your mind. And I was very interested in this idea or this method. I don't practice it myself, but the concept of it was very intriguing because it means you can also build a new space and architecture in your mind. And then I wanted to somehow use this method or refer to this method somehow in this narration, because it will be about having something placed in somewhere and then going off, but then lose the way back, or trying to remember the way back to this information that you had stored. So I had a sort of vague working framework, and then I went to Berlin to write it in this form. And then how it was received, I don't know. How did you feel? That would be my question to you. So it's this form, but it's very instructional, right? Also, the performance of the voiceover narration, my direction was to have some kind of hypnotist talking to you to lure you into your state and then go through your mind. So that was my direction for the voiceover actor.
Well, it worked for me quickly. I can add that I grew up in a neighborhood like this in Poland, and I really I kept going to this mental image of like, what did I see when I was like going out of the door of like my first like Soviet apartment building. So it did work, and it was very disorienting. Like it like didn't really create like it couldn't create a real path, but partly because I was like going between my memory and between what I was seeing. So like, and finding some matches and some crashes, which I think is basically kind of like what you're trying to do with the film, is like that you kind of can't find, like, really find the feeling of home in these places, but maybe like a hint, right? And that was also my question. I was like, oh, what did you find for yourself when you went?
Okay. I'm glad that it worked. I was the ultimate, my wish for the audience to go through this experience of going through a maze or labyrinth, mentally speaking, and also visually. What did I find for myself? I found some kind of comfort, sense of comfort, to know that something that's similar still exists in the world. Especially the Jimenstadt, the first location that you see with like a gigantic tree that goes, the camera pans up to it, was built in 1930s, and it is UNESCO heritage protected site for modern housing estates in Germany. That was designed by Hans Scharoun, who is one of the important name in German history of modern architecture. So yeah, in a way that will be preserved. Like, I'm just personally speaking, I'm very happy to find this place. Yeah, thank you.
It's interesting because for me, it was a bit the opposite, because I'm not super sensitive or like receptive to meditation in general. And I was feeling, but yeah, when you talk about a maze, like I was feeling like in a labyrinth, like I was like lost a bit. But when the performers were speaking, like it was really like, I don't know, potent at this moment. Like it was really strong for me when they were speaking. So yeah, that's interesting. And I was just wondering if you could address something about class, because I feel like there is a big tension between the both universe that that you make like unfold. Because yeah, you have this classical music that will pierce through time and get the great buildings and the nice spaces, and also these spaces that come from the same era of architecture, but that will get destroyed because they were not built to last, even if so much memories were made there. And yeah, it just, for me, like screening the both movies together, like really brought that for me.
Class, you mean? What do you mean by that?
In terms of economic, social class. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it's one of the things that I found quite different from the European examples of this large housing estates and in South Korea and most East Asian countries, is we do have in South Korea those apartment complexes for social programs, but also it is very middle class, middle upper class, very one of the most desirable and expensive form of living. So there is but then in the European examples, or even in North American examples, I know these buildings or these neighborhoods are planned for most of the time social housing. So I think in a way it was somehow difficult for me to connect with that history of European and North American examples, because there is so much taboo, if I could say, or there's so much sort of stigma or stereotypes that are attached to these neighborhoods, contemporarily speaking. They're mostly considered low-income neighborhoods with a lot of crimes, which is the stereotype. It's not necessarily a true condition. So I was. This is something that I've learned recently, or more or less recently, since I was interested in researching for the history of these neighborhoods in different contexts, in different geopolitical contexts. So I'm not sure if I can address the this idea or this presence of class there in my film, but what I could say is I am aware of these gaps that happens when one of the agendas or one of the architectural or urban planning ideas get translated or transplanted into other countries. It could become something very different in a way. It could unfold into something much more, well, very, very different in a way. So I find that quite interesting and something for me to research further into how this is created. Or so yeah.
Okay. The subject of it wasn't the class issue is, of course, it's not the subject of the film, but of course if you think a little bit, you know it, because of course it's most of them are students and they go to very expensive schools. So we know that, but it wasn't the subject. I don't think I have had that in my mind, but I know that it's there. But yeah, I just want to put the focus on something else.
Okay, if there are no further questions or insights, okay, I suppose we can all give a round of applause for our wonderful filmmakers here. Thank you again for your wonderful films.